Please, don't take my child away, the widow's voice cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched the thin arm of her little girl. Dust swirled across the town square, the sheriff's stern eyes fixed on the woman, his jaw tight with duty. Papers were folded in his hand, papers that carried more power than her desperate cries, papers that said debts unpaid must be settled, even if it meant selling the only blood she had left. The townsfolk whispered from the wooden sidewalks, pretending to busy themselves but watching every move. To them, it was another day of justice, another sad story of a poor woman swallowed by the hunger of the frontier. Yet to her, it was her whole world unraveling before her eyes. Her husband had been gone for 2 winters, lost to fever and buried in frozen ground with only a wooden cross to mark his name. She had tilled, she had begged, she had prayed, but nothing was enough. The land yielded no mercy, and creditors grew sharper by the day. Her daughter's tears soaked the worn fabric of her dress, small fingers clutching at her waist with the kind of desperation only a child could have. "Mama, don't let them take me," the girl whimpered, her voice too soft for a world so cruel. The widow shook her head, whispering promises she knew she could not keep. And then, from the edge of the crowd, boots crunched against gravel. A tall man in a weather-beaten hat, his face hidden by the brim, stepped forward. The murmur of voices fell silent as if the wind itself had paused. Everyone knew him, the silent rancher, the man who lived beyond the western hills where the prairie stretched wide and wild. He was a man of few words, scarred by loss, hardened by solitude. Some said he hadn't spoken more than a sentence in years, that his silence was heavier than iron chains. He walked with slow, deliberate steps until he stood between the widow and the sheriff. The girl looked up, her tear-streaked face catching a flicker of light in his shadow. His hand, rough from years of labor and calloused from rope and reins, reached out, not to take, not to demand, but to shield. He planted himself like an oak in a storm, unyielding, immovable. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "This ain't your matter," he said gruffly, but the weight in his voice betrayed his own discomfort. "The law's clear. Debt must be paid, one way or another." For a long moment, the man said nothing. The silence stretched until it pressed against the chest of every onlooker, until even the sheriff lowered his eyes. Then, in a voice deep and worn, he spoke just 3 words. "She stays here." The widow gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The crowd rippled with shock. The rancher had spoken, and his voice carried the kind of authority that could not be written on paper or broken by law. The sheriff cleared his throat, struggling for ground. "And who'll pay what she owes?" "You." The rancher's jaw tightened, and he nodded once. "I'll settle it." A hush fell over the square, and for the first time, the widow looked fully at him. His eyes were not hard as she had imagined, but deep pools of grief and strength, carrying storms of their own. He did not look at her with pity, nor with possession. He looked at her as if he understood, the endless nights of fear, the empty cupboards, the hollow ache of loss. The sheriff grumbled, but he could not argue against silver when it was offered, nor against a man whose word carried the weight of his fists and his rifle. "Very well," he muttered, stuffing the papers back into his coat. "But don't say I bent the law for you." The rancher gave no reply. His silence was enough. The widow sank to her knees, clutching her daughter tightly, tears spilling from her eyes, not of despair, but of relief so sharp it cut through her like a knife. She whispered thank yous she could not stop, words tumbling over one another in a stream of gratitude, but the man only tipped his hat and turned, ready to walk back into the dust and solitude he had come from. But the child, still holding her mother's hand, called out softly, "Wait." He froze. Slowly, he turned back. Her small eyes, wide with innocence and wonder, met his. "Why did you help us?" she asked, her voice trembling. For a long time, he said nothing, and the town held its breath once more. Then, with a voice low and almost broken, he answered, "Because once, no one helped me." And with that, he turned toward the horizon, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. Yet the widow knew this was not the end, that a thread had been tied that day, binding her life and her child's to the silent rancher who had carried their burden as if it were his own. And for the first time in years, hope flickered in her chest like a lantern against the dark. The dust had barely settled in the square when the crowd began to disperse, whispers scattering like startled birds. Some shook their heads in disbelief, some muttered about the stubbornness of the rancher, and others quietly admired what they had just witnessed. But the widow remained rooted in place, her daughter clinging to her waist, her knees weak beneath her. The sheriff's boots echoed on the wooden boards as he retreated, the loss satisfied by the promise of silver, leaving behind the taste of shame and relief. The widow's heart hammered against her ribs. She had begged, she had pleaded, and in the very moment when her voice had lost its power, when her arms could not shield her child from the cruelty of the world, a stranger had stepped forward. A man who owed her nothing. A man who had spoken little but had carried the weight of heaven and earth in his silence. Her little girl whispered, her face buried against her. "Mama, he saved us." "Yes," the widow breathed, her voice breaking into the wind, "he did." She lifted her eyes to where he stood at the edge of the square. He had not gone far, only turned toward the open road that would lead him back to his ranch. He did not look back, as though his deed required no acknowledgement, no thanks, no return. The brim of his hat shielded his face, and his shoulders bore the burden of a life no one else could understand. Something about him seemed carved from the land itself, rugged, enduring, lonely. "Mama, will we see him again?" her daughter asked, her words carrying both fear and hope. The widow swallowed hard. "I don't know, child. I truly don't know." But deep down, she knew something had shifted, something invisible but strong. The thread that had bound them in that moment could not be easily broken. That night, she sat by the dim light of a lantern in her small cabin at the edge of town, staring at the thin walls and the leaky roof, the meager table with its cracked edges, the cupboard nearly bare. Her daughter slept curled in a quilt beside her, the only quilt her husband had left before he passed. She brushed a strand of hair from the girl's forehead and wondered what sort of life was left for them. The debt was gone, or rather, transferred. It was the rancher who would pay now. That knowledge was both a comfort and a weight. She had been spared her child, but at what cost to him? Why had he done it? Why had he chosen her, when so many others suffered quietly and were swallowed whole by their poverty? The silent rancher's voice echoed in her mind, "Because once, no one helped me." Those words gnawed at her, not with fear, but with an ache she could not explain. What had he lost? What ghosts walked beside him in the empty halls of his ranch? The next morning dawned gray, a mist rising off the hills like smoke. She was gathering water from the well when she heard the distant thunder of hooves. Her heart caught in her throat as she looked up. There he was again, astride a dark stallion that seemed as untamed as the man himself. He rode with quiet command, the reins loose in his calloused hands, the animal responding as if it knew his thoughts before he gave them voice. He reined in near her fence, dismounting with slow grace. He did not speak at first. He simply tipped his hat, his eyes shadowed, and handed her a small sack. The weight of it surprised her, it was heavy with food, flour, beans, dried meat. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught. "I can't take this," she whispered. "You've already done more than I could ever repay." His gaze met hers, steady and unyielding. "It's not about repayment." His voice was low, gravelly, like stones shifting beneath a river. She stood there, torn between pride and gratitude. Her husband had always told her to stand tall, to never let charity steal her dignity. But this didn't feel like charity. This felt different. "Why?" she asked again, softer this time. "Why us?" He looked past her, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the mist curled into the hills. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because I know what it means to lose everything." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask more, but his silence drew a line she dared not cross. He tipped his hat once more, mounted his stallion, and was gone, the rhythm of hooves fading into the distance. The days that followed carried the scent of change. The sack of food sustained them through the week, and each morning her daughter looked toward the hills as though expecting to see the rancher ride out of the mist again. Sometimes, late at night, the widow found herself doing the same, imagining him out there alone, tending cattle beneath the stars, his silence a cloak that hid 1,000 untold stories. And then, one evening, when the sun burned low and red against the prairie, he came again. This time he brought timber and nails, tools strapped to his saddle. Without a word, he began repairing the broken boards of her porch, fixing the loose shutters that banged against the wind, patching the roof that leaked. She tried to stop him, to tell him he didn't have to, but he only gave her that steady look that said more than words ever could. Her daughter watched him with wide eyes, offering him water when he paused, trailing him with the eager admiration only a child could give. And slowly, something fragile began to grow, a trust, a bond, a sense that perhaps they were not as alone in the world as they had believed. The townsfolk whispered again. Some called it pity. Others called it charity. Some sneered that the silent rancher had finally found himself a widow to ease his solitude. But none of their words mattered within the small circle of light that began to form around the widow's cabin, where hammers struck nails and laughter, soft, hesitant laughter, began to stir again. One night, after the day's work was done, the widow found herself standing beside him on the porch, the stars blazing above them. The air smelled of pine and earth, of sweat and sawdust. Her daughter slept inside, her small breaths a steady rhythm in the quiet. "You've given us more than I can ever repay," she said, her voice trembling in the stillness. "Why keep coming back?" He took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair, and for the first time she saw the scars that lined his face, the shadows etched deep into his eyes. "Because every time I ride away," he said slowly, "I remember how it felt to lose my family. I buried them on my land years ago. My wife, my boy. Fever took them both. No one came. No one cared. And I swore if I ever saw someone else standing where I once stood, I wouldn't turn away." Her heart ached at his words, tears burning her eyes. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, a gesture so small yet filled with more gratitude than words could hold. He did not pull away. He simply stood there, solid and unyielding, a man carved by grief but softened by the choice to save instead of abandon. From that night forward, the rancher was no longer just a distant figure on horseback. He became a presence in their lives, quiet, steady, unwavering. He brought wood for the fire, taught the girl how to ride a pony he had gentled just for her, repaired fences, and tended the small patch of earth where the widow tried to grow vegetables. He never asked for anything in return, never demanded, never pushed. But with each act, he gave them something they had thought forever lost: safety, dignity, and hope. The widow found herself watching him when he worked, the strength in his arms, the patience in his hands, the sorrow that lingered behind his silence. And though her heart was still bruised by loss, she began to feel it stir again, slowly, cautiously, like a flower daring to lift its head after winter. The child, too, blossomed under his watchful care. She laughed more, slept without fear, and carried a lightness in her step that had been absent for too long. She clung to him with the innocent affection of one who had found a protector, a father she never remembered having. And as the seasons shifted, so too did their lives. The widow worked beside him, planting, mending, learning to share the weight of survival. The rancher, once a man of silence and solitude, found himself drawn into the warmth of a home he had thought forever closed to him. The prairie was still harsh, the world still unforgiving. But within that fragile circle of trust and kindness, something stronger than the cruelty of fate began to take root. And though no one could say what lay ahead, whether storms or drought, sorrow or joy, the widow knew one truth with absolute certainty: the day the silent rancher had stepped forward, everything had changed. The winds shifted as autumn came rolling in, carrying with it the crisp bite of change. The widow could feel it in the air, in the way the nights stretched longer and colder, in the way her daughter's laughter seemed freer, brighter, echoing against the cabin walls. The rancher had become a part of their days, a figure who no longer stood at the edge of their world but at the very heart of it. He was no longer only the silent man who had stepped forward in town that fateful day, he was the man who had built, repaired, carried, and stayed. Yet with every kindness, the widow felt a growing weight inside her chest. Gratitude, yes, but also something far deeper, something more dangerous. She had promised herself after her husband's death that she would not let her heart be vulnerable again, that she would build walls higher than the storms that had broken her. But walls were not made to hold out hands that healed, eyes that understood, or the steady silence of a man who had turned loneliness into sacrifice. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the cracked beams above, wondering what it would mean to let him into the chambers of her heart. Would it be betrayal to her husband's memory? Or was it simply what life demanded of the living, that they keep moving, keep loving, keep carrying the flame even when the first fire had gone out? Her daughter had no such doubts. The girl clung to the rancher as if he were the father she had been too young to remember. She followed him across the fields, peppered him with questions, brought him wildflowers and pebbles as gifts. She laughed when he lifted her onto the pony, clapped when he showed her how to guide the reins, and never once feared his silence. Children, the widow thought, had a way of seeing truth without needing words. But the town was not as kind. Whispers grew louder with each visit he made. Some said the rancher was a fool to waste his time on a woman with nothing to offer. Others said she was sly, using pity to trap a man with land and wealth. A few cruel tongues muttered that she was already living in sin, though no man had crossed her threshold after dark but him. The widow tried to ignore them, but words have a way of sinking into the skin, of feeding doubts already there. And one evening, when the sun had bled into the horizon and painted the hills in fire, she spoke her fear aloud. "You've given us more than we deserve," she said softly, standing beside him as he stacked firewood by the cabin. "But people talk. They don't understand why you help. They say," she faltered, ashamed to give voice to the poison. "They say I've trapped you. That I'm using you." The rancher stopped, his hands resting against the woodpile. He turned to her, his eyes steady in the fading light. "Let them talk," he said simply. "They've never known what it means to stand on the edge of losing everything." Her throat tightened. "But don't you see? I don't want to be another burden you carry." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "You're not a burden. You're the reason I remembered what it feels like to live." The words broke something inside her, not in pain, but in release. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the truth she had been too afraid to claim. He had not stepped forward that day in town only to save her child. He had stepped forward to save himself too, to pull himself out of the hollow silence that had been his prison. The months passed, and winter pressed down upon the land. Snow blanketed the hills, the wind howled against the cabin, and nights were long and bitter. But within their small home, warmth glowed. The rancher was there often, his presence as steady as the fire he kept alive in the hearth. He showed the widow how to mend tack, how to cut wood properly, how to read the signs of weather in the sky. And in turn, she taught him how to laugh again, how to share a meal at the table without silence being the only guest. One night, as snow whispered against the windows, he sat by the fire, her daughter curled asleep in his lap. He looked down at the child with a tenderness that pierced the widow's heart. She had never seen him so unguarded, so vulnerable, as if in that small, fragile body he had found the family he thought forever lost. When he lifted his eyes to meet hers, she knew the choice was no longer hers to wrestle with. Life had chosen for them. The spring thaw brought not only new grass and blossoms, but also the promise of a new life. The widow's cabin, once a place of sorrow and emptiness, now rang with the sounds of hammers and saws. Together, they expanded it, building stronger walls, wider rooms, a home meant not for surviving, but for living. The rancher moved pieces of his life into hers, one quiet act at a time, his tools by the door, his books on the shelf, his coat on the peg beside hers. One evening, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset, the widow's daughter darted between them, her laughter filling the air. She reached for both their hands and pulled them together, her small fingers linking theirs. The widow felt the roughness of his palm against hers, the strength in his grip, and she realized that the child had spoken without words what her own heart had long been whispering. It was not a grand declaration, not a proposal with flowers or rings. It was simpler, stronger. It was the way he stayed, the way he carried not only her burdens but her hopes, the way his silence had become a place of safety instead of fear. It was love, forged not in the fire of passion, the way his silence had become a place of safety instead of fear. It was love, forged not in the fire of passion, but in the steady rhythm of days survived together. The years stretched ahead, uncertain as all years are, but no longer empty. The widow no longer feared the future. The rancher no longer walked in silence alone. And the little girl no longer clutched her mother in terror of being taken away. Instead, she ran free in the fields, her laughter a promise that life, no matter how cruel, could be redeemed. The memory of that day in town never left them. It became a story they carried quietly between them, a reminder of the moment when despair gave way to hope, when silence broke to save a child, when a widow's plea was answered not by the law, but by the heart of a man who had once known the same pain. And in the years that followed, whenever the widow watched him from across the fields, his broad shoulders bent to work, his figure steady against the horizon, she would feel her chest swell with the same gratitude she had felt that first day. But it was no longer the gratitude of one who had been rescued. It was the gratitude of one who had been given back the courage to love, to live, and to believe in second chances. She knew the world would never stop being harsh. Storms would come, Losses would cut, whispers would sting. But now, she no longer faced them alone. Now, when the winds rose, she could look beside her and see him there, the silent rancher who had stepped forward when no one else would, who had carried her child and her heart into safety. And in his silence, she no longer heard emptiness. She heard strength. She heard love. She heard the answer to every prayer she had ever spoken into the cold night.